All right, so this is section 3 of chapter 7, and in this section we will discuss methods for controlling extraneous variables. So we're going to focus on 3 primary techniques that are used by psychologists in order to control for extraneous variables. And those are holding variables constant, matching variables across treatment conditions, and control by randomization. All right, so the first approach is holding variables constant. And what is meant by that is keeping variables the same for all participants in your study. Now, this includes variables that relate to the testing environment. For example, making sure that all the experiments are conducted in the same room. And also variables that relate to the participants themselves. So making sure your participants are very similar to each other. So for example, age will probably be a confound in many studies. And so to deal with this, you can hold age constant by recruiting people that are all the same age. So that's how you keep age constant in your study. And in doing so, of course, you remove age as a potential confound. Now, of course, in reality, it is very difficult to keep a variable completely constant. It would be very difficult most of the time and rather absurd if you only recruited people who were exactly 19 years old and not a day older or younger. So instead, what scientists will often do is come up with some allowable range for the variable. So in this case, a range of acceptable ages. So instead of one specific age, maybe you have a range of 18 to 23-year-olds or something like that. Now, there is a downside to keeping variables constant, and maybe you can guess what that is. When you hold a variable constant, you may increase internal validity by removing that variable as a confound, but you may partially jeopardize external validity because now it isn't clear if your results will generalize beyond these ranges that you have set for your variables. So again, there's a balancing act that you have to perform when doing research. And you as a researcher will need to make these sometimes difficult decisions. All right, so the next approach is matching across treatment conditions. And the idea here is to balance the conditions such that the potential confound that you're controlling does not vary systematically between your conditions. So if we stick to age as the example, if suppose condition A has 10 people between the ages of 18 and 24, and 10 people between the ages of 25 and 30, you want to make sure that condition B, your other condition, has the same breakdown, the same composition of ages. And so this allows for more variation within your treatment groups while avoiding those confounding differences between the treatment groups. Or another way of doing this is simply to ensure that the average age is the same or very similar for your treatment conditions. And again, this increases the variation across that variable, which can benefit external validity while avoiding the systematic differences between conditions, which could be a confound and threaten internal validity. All right, so that's matching. Now, suppose you have a within subjects design, meaning that the same group of people will undergo all the treatment conditions in your study. So when you have this, the order in which people go through these conditions can be a confound. And you have to worry about practice effects and fatigue effects. So let's say you're testing the effects of different genres of music on problem solving, an example that we've used before. What you want to do is make sure that the order in which people experience these different conditions isn't the same for everyone in your study. And this technique of shuffling the order for different participants is called counterbalancing. And we'll talk more about counterbalancing later on in the course. Here's just a simple example of counterbalancing. So if you have a sample, and if the idea is that all of these individuals will undergo both conditions, treatment A and B, then you want some people to start with A and then do B, and you want other people to start with B and then do A. And that's the basic idea of counterbalancing. So to come back to matching, matching is fairly feasible if you have like one variable that you really care about controlling. So if you only care about controlling age, and you have like two conditions, and you want roughly the same age between them, well, that shouldn't be too difficult. You can manage that. However, if you want your conditions to be matched on age and IQ and socioeconomic status and college major and political affiliation and personality traits, well, good luck to you with that. That is a nightmare inside of a nightmare. It's going to be very, very difficult. And the same thing goes for counterbalancing. If you only have two treatments, well, then there are only two ways of moving through those treatments, A then B or B then A. But if you have three treatments, now there are 6 possible ways of going through those treatments. And so if you have more treatments and more variables you want to match, both of these approaches, counterbalancing and matching, can become very problematic, time-consuming, and impractical. So given the fact that it is often very difficult or impractical to control or try to match potentially dozens and dozens of different extraneous variables that may exist in your study, another approach is to leverage the powers of chance in order to have balance across the conditions of your study. And this relies on randomization. And randomization is an unbiased approach which uses some random event, for example, a coin toss or a random numbers generator, to distribute your extraneous variables across the treatment conditions of your study. Now, one common example of this is known as random assignment. So this should not be confused with random selection. Recall, random selection is when you randomly select people from a population into your sample. Random assignment, however, is when you already have your sample and you randomly assign the people in your sample to the different treatment conditions in your experiment. And if your sample is large enough, then most of the time your conditions will end up being fairly similar on average if you assign people randomly to those conditions. All right, so what are the advantages and disadvantages of randomization? So the advantages is that you can control multiple extraneous variables at once without the headaches and complications that will arise from actively trying to balance or match your conditions across multiple variables. But the problem is that you are relying on chance. And chance will not always comply with your needs. Chance, randomness will not always cooperate with what you want. And it's possible, if you rely on chance alone, that you will end up with groups that are not well balanced, especially if you have small samples. So if you have 1,000 people per condition, random assignment will probably work pretty well. But if you have 10 people per condition, then it may not work quite so well. So given these problems, there's nothing stopping you from combining different approaches. And some people will combine randomization with some degree of control. So if there's one particular variable that you know will be a confound, that variable can be matched or held constant, while the other variables can be randomized and left up to chance. So here we have a comparison of these different methods that we've discussed. So in this example, there are two treatment conditions, condition 1 and 2, and there is a potential confounding variable of IQ. So A shows a situation where IQ has not been controlled. You can see that people with higher IQs are overrepresented in condition 2, and this is clearly a confound. There is a systematic difference between your conditions. So what can you do about this? Well, B illustrates the method of controlling variables by holding them constant. So in this situation, you recruit people into your study with the constraints that everyone should have roughly the same IQ. However, now you have a lot less variation, which could be a threat to external validity. So what are some other options? Well, C demonstrates the method of matching. And now, if you have a certain portion of high IQ individuals in treatment 1, then you have to ensure the same portion of high IQ individuals in treatment 2 as well. And this allows for greater variation while controlling this variable by eliminating any systematic differences between your conditions. And finally, D illustrates the method of randomization for controlling variables. So here, you simply use random assignment to create your treatment conditions, and this should, most of the time, if your samples are large enough, result in conditions that are roughly similar to each other on average.